She was denied entry at Pope Francis's memorial, dismissed like just another mourner. But when they learned she was his niece, everything changed. Want to know what happened next? Press that subscribe button and comment below where you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The square outside St. Peter's Basilica was drowning in black that morning, a sea of dark coats and umbrellas beneath a sky that seemed to understand the world's grief. Thousands stood in reverent silence, heads bowed against the soft Roman drizzle. Among them was a woman no one noticed. Anna Ferraro pulled her worn wool coat tighter as she approached the towering bronze gates that guarded the private entrance. Her black dress, simple, modest, years old, but freshly pressed for the occasion, hung just below her knees. No jewelry adorned her wrists or throat. No press badge swung from her neck. No security team cleared her path. Just a small handbag clutched in both hands and eyes that had long since surrendered to the sting of tears. She paused at the checkpoint, where two members of the Swiss Guard stood like statues in their Renaissance uniforms. An event coordinator with a tablet and an earpiece barely glanced up as she approached. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his accent crisp with efficiency. "This entrance is for family and official delegates only." He gestured vaguely toward the public square. "The general viewing area is over there." Anna hesitated, her lips parting slightly. She began, her voice softer than intended. But the coordinator had already turned away, his attention captured by a line of sleek, diplomatic vehicles gliding into the courtyard. Ambassadors and cardinals emerged, faces carefully arranged into appropriate solemnity, their black suits and crimson robes protected from the drizzle by hovering assistants with umbrellas. Anna stepped back without protest, instinctively making herself smaller against the ancient stone wall. She wasn't the type to make a scene, not here, not today. She stood awkwardly to the side as important people streamed past her. The chill of the morning seeped through her thin-soled shoes. Her eyes stung, not from anger, but from the particular loneliness of being unseen during a moment that should have been sacred, and she didn't blame them, really. How could they have known? To everyone here, she was just another face in the global tide of mourners, another tourist overwhelmed by proximity to history, just another stranger who had come to say goodbye to a pope. They couldn't know that to her, Pope Francis wasn't just a figurehead or a distant symbol of faith. He was Uncle Jorge, the man who had taught her to whistle through her fingers when she was 6, who slipped her extra chocolate during Lent when her mother wasn't looking, the man who had once told her, seated at a chipped formica table in their small Buenos Aires kitchen, "Never wear pride like a medal, Anna. It hides more of you than it shows." Her fingers tightened around her handbag, the only outward sign of the memories washing over her. Perhaps it was better this way, she thought. Uncle Jorge would have appreciated the irony. She could almost hear his raspy chuckle. "Always better to be unseen, querida, than to be seen for the wrong reasons." Still, she couldn't help wishing, just for a moment, that someone would look a little closer, that someone would see beyond her unremarkable appearance to the lifetime of love she carried. Anna took a small, resigned breath and stepped further back from the gates, retreating toward the edges of the square. She would not force her way in. She would not demand recognition. Instead, she would find her own quiet corner from which to say goodbye, alone, if necessary. As the memorial bells tolled overhead, Anna Ferraro, niece to the late Holy Father, stood among the unnoticed, her head bowed not in shame, but in quiet, stubborn love. The cold breeze tugged at the hem of Anna's dress as she moved further from the entrance, finding a spot where she could observe without intruding. Her hands, red from the chill, were clasped loosely before her like a child at prayer. She watched the steady stream of black suits and somber faces disappear into the grand basilica's embrace, swallowed by marble and shadow. As important people continued to arrive and the crowd shifted around her, Anna's mind drifted back to another life, far from the imposing stones of Vatican City. Back to Buenos Aires, Anna had grown up on a street of peeling paint and flowering jacaranda trees in Villa Devoto, a modest suburb where laundry lines stretched between apartment buildings and children played soccer in dusty courtyards. Their family had always been ordinary, almost stubbornly so, despite the rising prominence of their uncle. When Jorge Bergoglio had been elected pope, Anna was 22, working morning shifts at a small flower shop owned by Senora Diaz, an old family friend with arthritic hands and impossibly vibrant orchids. The world had erupted in headlines and processions. Anna had simply tied on her faded green apron, watered the chrysanthemums, and gone about her day as usual. Fame had never touched them, not because it hadn't tried, but because Uncle Jorge had been determined to shield them from it. "Your work is enough, querida," he had told her, smiling over a chipped plate of empanadas during a family dinner the Christmas after his election. His eyes, crinkled at the corners from decades of smiling, had held hers steadily. "Your kindness, your loyalty to your mother, you don't need the world's cameras to make these things real." When her mother, his sister, had fallen ill 2 years ago, Anna had stepped away from university to care for her. She'd balanced hospital visits with early morning shifts at the flower shop, her life narrowing to the gentle rhythm of duty and devotion. She had never sought interviews, never leveraged her connection for special treatment. Most of her neighbors didn't even know. She liked it that way. To her, he wasn't the man in white who waved from balconies and made headlines. He was the uncle who still sent handwritten letters to her mother on her birthday. His script, slightly crooked from arthritis, filled with the same warmth he'd always had. The world could have their pontiff. Anna treasured the man. When news of his passing had reached her, she hadn't called Vatican officials or booked a first-class ticket. She had packed a small suitcase, hands trembling slightly, as she folded the black dress her mother had worn to weddings and funerals for 20 years. She'd withdrawn her modest savings and boarded an overnight flight to Rome alone, surrounded by strangers who had no idea of the private grief sitting quietly in seat 32B. She hadn't come seeking recognition or privilege. She had come for him, for Uncle Jorge. The solemn notes of the choir now began drifting through the basilica's massive doors, floating across the square to where Anna stood. "Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domine. Grant them eternal rest, O Lord." And as she stood at the margins of a ceremony designed for dignitaries and cameras, Anna realized with a sad smile, if he could see her now, he wouldn't have wanted anything different. "Be small, querida," he had once whispered to her after Mass, when she was a teenager embarrassed by her secondhand clothes. "So God has more room to fill you." Inside the basilica, she imagined, the cavernous cathedral would be glowing with 1,000 candles. The processional would have wound its way up the center aisle by now, dignitaries finding their assigned places under the watchful eyes of Vatican ushers. Every movement would be precise, choreographed, centuries of tradition binding the moment in invisible thread. Anna, shivering slightly in the cooling afternoon, pictured what she couldn't see. The cypress wood coffin resting before the high altar, the Swiss guards standing rigid as statues along the towering columns, cardinals in their deep red vestments, heads bowed, world leaders with practiced expressions of solemnity, many of whom had argued with him in life, now united in ceremonial grief. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the isolation gnaw at her ribs. She had dreamed, quietly and without expectation, that she would at least sit among the faithful in a back pew. Not in the front rows reserved for presidents and prime ministers, but simply there, close enough to whisper a final prayer, in the space where his voice had once echoed across marble floors. Instead, she remained outside, pressed against the coldness of stone, separated from him by protocol and ceremony. A group of diplomatic aides hurried past her toward a secondary gate, speaking rapidly into earpieces. Nearby, cameras flashed as someone important, she didn't recognize the face, posed with practiced solemnity beside a cardinal. Anna lowered her eyes. She didn't blame them. Everyone mourned in their own way. Still, something about it felt wrong. The velvet ropes, the guest lists, the whispered politics of seating arrangements, when the man they gathered for had spent his life walking past palaces to kneel beside the forgotten. Uncle Jorge would have hated this parade. He would have slipped away through side doors to sit with the ordinary people beyond the barricades. "If I cannot smell the sheep," he had once joked, after becoming pope, when asked about his habit of sneaking out of the Vatican. Then I am no true shepherd. A young priest rushed past Anna, nearly colliding with her, his arms filled with bound liturgical books. He didn't pause or apologize, didn't even see her. She stepped back instinctively, accustomed to making way, her shoe scuffing against the ancient stones. She considered leaving altogether. Was her presence even necessary? Was her private grief enough, even standing here? At the fringes. Maybe she should find a small chapel elsewhere in the city, light a candle, say goodbye in solitude without disrupting the carefully planned choreography of this grand farewell. Her hand moved to her handbag, fingers brushing against the stem of a single white rose she had purchased that morning from a street vendor near her modest hotel. A small offering, simple, just like him. She closed her eyes against the sudden pressure of tears. The basilica doors loomed ahead, so close, yet barred by the layers of protocol and polished authority. Anna wasn't angry, not really. She understood the need for order, especially in a place carrying the weight of centuries. She only wished, just for a moment, that someone would look beyond her plain dress, her quiet posture, her lack of credentials, and see what mattered. The heart that beat, not for the trappings of faith, but for its essence. Not for the pope of white robes and global importance, but for the simple, stubborn man who had once told a little girl that greatness was measured not by applause, but by how quietly you could love. The choir's voices swelled within the basilica, lifting ancient Latin verses toward the heavens. Anna bowed her head. She would not push, she would not plead. She would trust, as he had taught her, that sometimes the unseen things mattered most. And if no one noticed, it would not make her love any smaller. Her goodbye, whispered on the wind, would find him somehow. It had to. Anna turned slowly from the basilica, wiping discreetly at her eyes with the back of her hand. Perhaps it was time to leave this place of marble and gold, to find a quiet corner of Rome where grief could breathe. She moved carefully through the thinning crowd, her shoulders hunched slightly against the cold that seemed to have settled permanently in her bones. The Vatican Square, massive and imposing, made her feel smaller with each step, her lone figure dwarfed by towering columns and centuries of power. As she wove between clusters of tourists and pilgrims, her shoulder accidentally brushed against an elderly priest struggling to balance a leather-bound prayer book while managing his walking cane. The collision, gentle as it was enough to unbalance him. The heavy book slipped from his grasp, landing on the cobblestones with a dull thud. Without thinking, Anna bent to retrieve it. Her mother had raised her with reflexive kindness, the sort that acts before the mind can calculate advantage or cost. "Here, father," she said softly in hesitant Italian, offering the book with both hands, the way she'd been taught to pass sacred things. The priest squinted at her through thick glasses, his weathered face like a map of ancient hills. "Grazie, figlia mia," he said, his voice like dry leaves rustling. He accepted the book, carefully brushing off the cover with trembling fingers. Then his gaze sharpened, focusing on her face with sudden intensity. "You are not a tourist," he said. Not a question, but a quiet observation. Anna hesitated. She could have nodded, smiled politely, and gone on her way, but something in the priest's kind eyes, something that reminded her achingly of her uncle, invited honesty. "I'm here for the memorial," she admitted softly. He tilted his head, bird-like. "You are alone." "I wasn't allowed inside," she confessed, eyes dropping to the worn stones beneath her feet. The priest's brow furrowed, deeply lines appearing between white eyebrows. "And yet, you came anyway?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. A long pause stretched between them, filled with the distant murmur of prayers and shuffling feet. Then, very quietly, he asked, "What is your name, child?" "Anna," she said simply. Then, after a heartbeat of hesitation, "Anna Ferraro." The effect of her surname was immediate. The priest's rheumy eyes widened, recognition blooming across his face like sunrise over distant hills. "You are," he began, voice lowering to an astonished whisper, "his sister's daughter." Anna gave a small, self-conscious smile. "Yes, The old priest exhaled sharply, almost dropping his prayer book again, as his free hand moved to his chest in shock. For a moment, he simply stared at her, this unremarkable woman in her simple black dress, standing forgotten in the shadow of such magnificence. "Wait here," he said suddenly, gripping her arm with surprising strength for one so frail. Without another word, he turned and moved toward the basilica gates with unexpected purpose, leaning heavily on his cane but moving with determination. Anna stood frozen, uncertain whether to follow or remain where she was. Her instinct was to slip away quietly, to avoid causing any disruption. But something deeper, something rooted in faith and trust, kept her feet still. Minutes ticked by. The crowd shifted around her. And then the priest returned, accompanied by a tall, stern-faced official in Vatican attire. Anna tensed, expecting another dismissal. Instead, the official studied her face for a long moment, then bowed slightly. "Miss Ferraro," he said with quiet formality, "please come with us." Confusion washed over Anna, followed by a wave of something she couldn't name, relief perhaps, or vindication. With hesitant steps, she followed the two men back toward the guarded entrance she had been turned away from earlier. This time, the Swiss guard stepped aside without question. The coordinator with the tablet, the same one who had dismissed her an hour earlier, looked up as she approached, his face draining of color as understanding registered in his eyes. Anna felt no triumph at his discomfort, only a strange sadness for both of them, caught in a world that too often confused importance with worth. The gates opened silently, and Father Matteo, as she would later learn was the elderly priest's name, guided her personally into the basilica through a side entrance, away from curious eyes and flashing cameras. Inside, the cathedral's grandeur enveloped her like an embrace. Soaring arches disappeared into shadows high above. Marble pillars, polished by centuries of reverent hands, gleamed softly in the candlelight. The air hung heavy with incense and history. They led her not to the front rows where dignitaries sat in careful order of precedence, but to a simple wooden pew along the side aisle, close enough to see the cypress coffin resting before the high altar, yet removed from the official proceedings. Anna lowered herself onto the bench, grateful for its solidity as her legs suddenly felt unsteady. No announcement heralded her presence, no heads turned in recognition. There were no whispers, no stares. And yet, in that quiet corner of marble and candlelight, she belonged. She felt it deep in her bones. This wasn't about who she was by name or title. It was about who she was by heart. The choir's voices lifted once more in ancient lament, and Anna finally allowed her tears to fall freely. Not from shame or anger, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of being where she needed to be. As the Latin prayers washed over her, Anna slipped the white rose from her handbag and cradled it gently in her lap. She would wait until the right moment. She would stay until the final blessing was given, the last candle extinguished. She would say goodbye, not in grand speeches or public declarations, but in the only way she knew. Quietly, completely, with all the love she carried in her simple, faithful heart. The final notes of the requiem faded into reverent silence, leaving only the occasional whisper of robes against stone and the soft flickering of candle flames. Anna remained seated, hands folded protectively over the white rose in her lap. She made no move to stand, no attempt to draw attention from the important figures now beginning to file out of the basilica. But their eyes found her anyway. It began as a ripple of recognition among the junior clergy, those who had spent enough time in the Holy Father's presence to recognize the unmistakable resemblance around her eyes, the same quiet dignity in her posture. "Is that?" one young priest whispered to another. "I think she's his sister's daughter," came the hushed reply. Word spread like a slow tide across the marble floor, not in loud announcements, but in the subtle shifting of gazes, the small adjustments of respect. The Archbishop of Buenos Aires, recognizing her immediately from family gatherings years before, bowed his head slightly as he passed, a private gesture of acknowledgement and contrition for her earlier treatment. A few cardinals, stiff in their formal grief, faltered briefly as they processed out. Some looked ashamed when they understood. Others simply looked moved by the unexpected presence of family so ordinary, so removed from pomp. Anna noticed little of this quiet ripple effect. Her focus remained on the simple wooden coffin at the foot of the altar, the same coffin her uncle had requested in his will, insisting it be plain cypress wood without gilding or ornamentation, true to his life, true to the values he had lived by and tried to teach. As the main congregation thinned, a few attendees lingered behind. Among them was Cardinal Rossi, a tall, austere man Anna vaguely remembered from photographs, who approached her pew with measured steps. He removed his zucchetto respectfully and inclined his head. "I believe we owe you an apology," he said, his Italian precise but kind. "Today, we celebrated a man who taught us humility, and yet..." He paused, genuine regret softening his formal demeanor. "We forgot to practice it ourselves." Anna lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no accusation there, no hint of resentment, only the same grace her uncle had exemplified throughout his life. "You honored him better than many of us today," the cardinal finished softly. He bowed once more and walked away, his crimson robes whispering against the ancient stones. Anna remained seated a while longer, after the last visitor had departed and the basilica had returned to its natural, echoing silence. The acknowledgement of her presence, the whispers, the bowed heads, had never been what she sought. What mattered was that love, simple and unadorned, had found its place, exactly where it belonged, exactly as her uncle would have wanted it. When the basilica had emptied completely, Anna rose slowly from the pew. With careful steps, she approached the small altar where the coffin rested. She knelt, not with the practiced grace of the cardinals, but with the honest reverence of someone who understood that true faith lives in ordinary moments. No cameras recorded her movement. No reporters pressed forward for a statement. Only the marble saints, the flickering candles, and the vast, ageless silence witnessed her farewell. Anna placed the white rose, slightly wilted now from being carried all day, at the foot of the coffin. Then she bowed her head and whispered words meant only for him. Not prayers for the Pope, who had led millions, but loving goodbyes to the uncle who had shown her that greatness isn't measured by titles or robes. It's measured by how gently you hold the world's forgotten corners. The last echoes of footsteps had long since faded beyond the great bronze doors. Anna remained kneeling, her simple black dress pooled around her on the cool marble floor. For the first time that day, she was truly alone with him. The white rose rested against the smooth cypress wood, small and slightly bent, nothing like the elaborate floral tributes and official wreaths surrounding it. Yet somehow it seemed the most fitting tribute of all. Anna stayed motionless for a long moment, forehead resting against clasped hands. She didn't ask for anything, didn't plead for comfort or strength. She simply gave thanks for the man who had carried the weight of the world without losing the spark of mischief in his eyes. Thanks for the uncle who had written her birthday letters in his cramped, careful script, even while leading a global faith. Thanks for the lesson he had taught her again today. That greatness isn't found in marble halls or television appearances. It's found in how we treat the small moments no one sees. A soft sound broke the silence, the gentle creak of ancient wood as a sacristan, believing the basilica empty, entered to begin extinguishing the hundreds of candles. Anna rose, brushing wrinkles from her dress with hands that bore the small calluses of someone accustomed to practical work. She moved toward the side of the altar, careful not to disturb anything, each footstep whispering against stone. Before turning to leave, she allowed herself one final look. The simple coffin, the wooden crucifix laid upon it, the white rose nestled beside it, trembling slightly in a breath of air from some distant open window. She smiled, small, sad, genuine. Uncle Jorge would have hated the pomp of a state memorial. He would have preferred a kitchen table with chipped edges, a shared pot of mate, prayers murmured over steaming cups. And somehow, standing here unnoticed by cameras and crowds, Anna had given him exactly that. The massive bronze doors beckoned as she made her way through the empty basilica. Outside, the light had changed, morning's gray drizzle replaced by afternoon sun that broke through clouds in golden shafts. She paused at the threshold, taking one last look at the sacred space behind her. No crowds, no dignitaries, no speeches, just silent stone and shadow keeping their own vigil. Anna stepped outside, blinking as sunlight warmed her face. The Vatican Square had largely emptied too. Only scattered groups of tourists and pilgrims remained, their small figures dwarfed by the massive colonnades that embraced the plaza like protective arms. No one glanced her way, no one pointed or whispered, and Anna was glad. Fame had never touched her, and today, perhaps more than ever, she understood that it never should. At the foot of the steps, Father Mateo waited quietly, leaning heavily on his cane. When Anna approached, he didn't immediately speak, just nodded with the patient understanding of someone who had witnessed decades of human joy and sorrow. "You honored him well," he said finally, his voice rough with age and emotion. Anna shook her head gently. "He honored all of us. I just remembered." The priest's eyes crinkled at the corners, so like her uncle's that it made her heart catch. He reached slowly into his cassock and withdrew something small, pressing it into her palm. A wooden rosary, simple beads worn smooth by years of prayer. "He kept this on his desk," Father Mateo said softly. "I think he would want you to have it." Anna accepted it reverently, running her thumb over the smooth wooden beads before tucking it carefully into her handbag where the rose had been. She thanked him with a small nod, words suddenly beyond her, and turned toward the winding cobblestone streets that led away from the Vatican's imposing walls. As she walked, her figure growing smaller against Rome's ancient skyline, no one who passed her would have guessed her story. No one would have known that inside the great basilica, behind all the pageantry and formal farewells, the truest goodbye had been offered by the most ordinary hands. And that, Anna thought with the ghost of a smile, was exactly how he would have wanted it. No cameras, no ceremonies, just one white rose and a heart full of love. Have you ever been judged by your appearance, only for others to later discover your true worth went far deeper than they ever imagined? Do you believe that real love and loyalty are shown not in grand public gestures, but in quiet moments when no one is watching? And if you were in Anna's place, would you have walked away quietly or found your own way to say goodbye? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story about unseen strength and quiet dignity. Share this video with someone who understands that the most meaningful goodbyes aren't always the loudest. They're the ones whispered with love. Our next story is appearing on your screen now. Watch it next and join us tomorrow for another unforgettable journey into the hidden courage of ordinary lives.